Hi all, my group is presenting chapter 6 of Baldwin's book. It's on the sporting life. Starting off the detailed arguments of chapter 6, in the section Playing Out Moments of Race Pride, Johnson's win represented an alternative way of being that was against the social order during the time of the movement. The masculinity of Johnson and the power that the Chicago sports teams like the Giants and the Blackhawks held were expressions of the mental and physical power of African Americans during this movement. In the second section of this chapter, Baldwin cites that Johnson would do things at the time that were seen as going against the social order. He considered them as acts of arrogance. Johnson's public display of these acts led to anxiety for Black leaders. This section also mentions that stereotypes such as people of color having biological or cultural inferiority were based on a racial science. This so-called science that white people used was not based on any real evidence and threatened racial uplift. In the third section of the chapter, athletic acculturation through the playground movement and recreation programs in Black schools and churches were used when sporting life started veering towards professionalism in 1910. Mainstream muscular Christians and reformers viewed recreation as an opportunity for moral purity and racial uplift and avoided the demands for victory. Athletic reformers did not make big strides in separating amateurism and professionalism in recreation, and athletes continued to want to display superiority in an arena where both players had equality. Professional competition in Black sporting life allowed for entrepreneurship as well.
So I'm going to be going over the second part of chapter 6, and I'm going to be detailing some of the main arguments that Baldwin makes in regards to baseball, basketball, football, and the Harlem Renaissance. And in the last section, I'm going to be talking about three of his main arguments. To highlight quickly, baseball. We have a main character, Andrew Foster, who was involved in resistance against white capitalism. He fought for autonomy and economic freedom for Black men in baseball, and it resulted in the liberation of the Black community. It brought race pride to African Americans, it brought hope, and it was a showing of athletic superiority in baseball. Secondly, we have the basketball movement, where we have the Harlem Renaissance Five. You can see a picture of them in the right-hand corner. And they have a character, Abe Saperstein, who was their white manager. Their team name was the Harlem Globetrotters, and they had a white manager so they could participate in more games. This allowed them to participate in a world championship, which they ended up winning and defeated many white teams, once again bringing, race pride and hope to the African American community. It showed athletic superiority, and they showed athletic superiority in football as well. We have the main figure, Frederick Douglass Fritz Pollard, who is he's a key figure. He faced racial violence on the field. He became the first African American named to the backfield of Walter's Camp All-American team. And most importantly, he created an all-star exhibition team that defeated a white team in Chicago. This created race consciousness in football and continued to exhibit that in the new Negro era. Baldwin argues that this was one of the more forgotten about topics in the Harlem Renaissance. And lastly, in the section, this was the end of chapter 6, so it concluded a lot and summarized his ideas, and I picked three main arguments he makes. He argues that interracial sports lead to a place where class conflict happens, and not only that, but visions of racial respectability and pride are outcomes of it. In the sense, you have African Americans and white people competing against each other, and through all of the accomplishments and pushes African Americans made during this time, It allowed for people to develop respectability, and it allowed for the African American community once again to build pride. Secondly, we have the argument that the push for the new Negro sporting life was a main contributor to the transformation of the American cultural landscape. As it's well known, America is well based off of sport. This is a major capitalist and economic idea in America. And, you know, all these pushes that the African Americans made are still existent today within sports. We have, safety for body autonomy, not only for Black people, but for white people as well. We have the economic freedom, the ability for football players, basketball players, baseball players to leave teams to move and get a payable wage, since there is levels of exploitation within the games, as it's a capitalist idea. And if it's based off of racism in the start, we can remember that racism is also about economics and exploiting someone. And that goes to the last argument that he makes, that since the sporting life created a leisure-based form of labor, capitalist ideologies saw the new race as an enterprise that could be capitalized upon. And what that means is, they saw that they could capitalize on sport and owning Black teams. As we look at Abe Saperstein, he was the owner of a Black team, and white supremacists and white leaders, saw this as an economic opportunity, ownership over Black people once again, and the ability to gain um, monetary funds.
Okay, so two of the key people mentioned in chapter 6. First, we have Rube Foster. He was a very successful Black pitcher who also had understood the market forces which shaped Chicago's sporting life. He had a very successful career as a pitcher playing against white teams, and eventually he had left his playing career and had developed his own team in Chicago, where he urged Black players to join him because the white owners of other Black teams were unfairly limiting the players' ability to seek better wages by banning team hopping. And then as a manager, he had capitalized on victories over white teams and built an image of race pride while increasing financial capital. And when eventually he had formed his own team named the Chicago American Giants, and this would eventually lead him to create the National Negro League, which is widely regarded as the first successful league for African American players. The NNL received a lot of support from spectators and offered Black players a platform to showcase their talent and receive better pay. And overall, Rube Foster represented the ability for African Americans to profit in the sporting world through both entrepreneurial spirit and athletic talent. And then another person who is very similar to Rube Foster, but in football, Frederick Douglass Fritz Pollard. And he started off, he was a multiple sport all-county athlete at Albert Lane Technical High School. After he graduated, he went back and forth playing for esteemed Ivy League football powerhouses such as Brown, Dartmouth, and Harvard. He would go back and forth between these teams, but eventually ended up at Brown. And while he was playing there, he experienced a ton of threats of racial violence on the field and also struggled academically. But despite this, he led the team to the Rose Bowl in 1916, and he was also the first African American named to Walter Camp's All-American team. After graduating college, he started to coach at Lincoln University while also playing for the Akron Indians, which was in the American Professional Football Association, which had later become the NFL. And after playing at this team, he decided he had wanted to organize a Black All-Star exhibition team to play against an all-white team. And this was to demonstrate Black equality, inclusion, and athletic superiority. And then after that, he had done it again and organized the Chicago Blackhawks, and just to demonstrate Black athletic prowess against white professional teams to seek more inclusion and representation in the sporting world. And then after this, after his career as a player and coach, he decided to start his own newspaper, which was providing extensive coverage of African American sports, and he was giving athletes the ability to be recognized while also profiting, and then overall he was just considered the first Black NFL player and coach, and he was very successful as a player and a coach.
Lastly, we're going to talk about 3 key terms from this chapter. These terms include people, concepts, and ideas. First, Jack Johnson. Johnson was a Black British boxer that was extremely dominant in the sport of boxing during the early 20th century. What made him so famous, however, was not just his dominance in the sport, but how he performed Black masculinity. His masculinity was tied to his physical appearance. It was tied to an arrogant and cocky personality. It was tied to braggadociousness in a way that other forms of Black masculinity during the time had not. The way masculinity during the time had been performed was tied to a higher moral discipline. And he did not subscribe to that. Johnson was what you would consider a dandy, a man who was very concerned about his physical appearance. This concept of a man had been deemed effeminate during the earlier years. However, his hyper-masculine portrayal of that, which predated some of the hyper-masculine, braggadocious arrogance that came later in Black masculinity during the later 20th century, his form of dandyism was arrogant, it was combative, and it was hyper-masculine in a way that legitimized how he performed. His existence was both a boogeyman and an outlet for Black people. His existence was cautioned by many Black leaders and Black speakers who told Black men to not act like him due to the respectability politics and due to the fact that acting like him would get a lot of Black men killed. However, he was an outlet for those specific Black men due to the fact that his arrogance and his personality never seemed to bend to the will of the white people he was surrounded by. From the white perspective, his dominance in the sport was confusing and very much flew in the face of the prevailing white science that deemed white people across the board superior. The fact he was dominant in the sport of boxing showed physical superiority over white people. This made him and other Black athletes fall into the paradox of playfulness, which pretty much deemed that his dominance in the sport was due to his primitive African heritage. However, if he had been terrible at the sport, his terrible and inferiority would have been tied to his Blackness. Johnson and Washington were also 2 Black figures that were famous around the same time, and Washington was known to admonish him and his behavior constantly. However, Johnson and critiques of Washington noted that some of Washington's admonishing of Johnson, aka Johnson was famous because of white people, and white people really only let one Black person be famous around the same time. They kind of called him out for being a hypocrite because his fame was also tied to white acceptance. Next concept is muscular Christianity. This was a concept that really arose during the turn of the 20th century and industrialization, which led a lot of people into cities, however, led also to a push for more physical activity. Muscular Christianity advocated that competitive team sports and physical education could teach lessons of manliness to men, a concept that was really different from the prevailing concepts of manliness, which was tied to mental superiority and physical repression. The modern era, the early 20th century, saw a change in that. This also coincided with the rise of sports and sport entertainment. Next, we're going to talk about sports styles. The first style, the white style, equaled standard style. This was a style that was legitimate. This was a style that was performed by white athletes, and it was a style that was very scientific and linear and offensive. It was a style that was what was taught when playing the game. However, Black athletes were often not allowed to just perform that style, but had to perform a much more adaptive and defensive style of athleticism. This defensiveness and flexibility was due to the fact that Black athletes were fighting for less resources, as well as were playing in a field that was not applying to them the same way. The rules not applying to them the same way. Because of that, a lot of their performances were showman-y, were trickster-y, and had a lot of signature styles due to the need for showmanship and adaptability. These are just three of the many concepts that were talked about in this chapter.